The discourse around modern boys, and white boys especially, is woeful, made up mostly of second-rate commentators getting on their high horse, with shallow and inadequate arguments for clicks that fail to get to the heart of what is actually going on with this often maligned demographic. The Netflix show Adolescence is the first clear instance of contentiously message-driven entertainment that is also of brilliant quality as a work of art, making middle-class parents more susceptible to giving it credence as an almost documentary-style warning. Adolescence took two good ideas, the pitfalls of the internet for boys and knife crime in the UK, but messed up trying to shove them together into one narrative where a white 13-year-old boy impulsively becomes a murderous stabber, transferring the issues of other communities onto the one group in society it is still permissible to disproportionately attribute or scapegoat for societal ills. There is no basis in reality or crime data to back up the premise that watching Andrew Tate videos and using potently coded emojis and online chat might turn a white boy from a lower middle-class stable family background into a misogynistic murderer. It instead has engendered a moral panic, getting middle-class mothers fretting about what their sons are doing online, and led to teachers wanting to show the Netflix series in schools. Another instance of boys being told by importuning grown-ups that they are being chastised not for what you do, but for who you are. I'm going to try to fill the breach as best I can with a comprehensive exploration that necessitates going to some uncomfortable places and being forthright about the unpalatable elements no one else seems willing to do. Because without uncompromising inquiry, we won't make much progress around the societal tensions when it comes to boys, and white boys especially. At the heart of the problem are two key factors: social constructivism and pornography. The social constructivists believe that gender is socially constructed, that there are no real, distinct male proclivities, and therefore all the characteristics of gender difference are really just boys abiding by a societal script that they feel they have to perform, and which inhibits them from becoming their ideal, authentically sensitive selves. Thing is, social constructivism is garbage, one of the most toxic ideologies of our time, and has disoriented conceptions of gender almost entirely on the male side. It has been scholastically shown to be garbage because the Scandinavian countries pushed social constructivist ideas to their fullest extent, and what happened was the differences between the genders actually maximized, the exact opposite of what the social constructivists envisaged and wanted. Social constructivism has brought about a horrible modern blurring, where the term toxic masculinity used to mean there is an intrinsically good masculinity that can get warped or drift into a toxic form, but has now come to mean, in the eyes of many, that there is no intrinsic masculinity, and therefore the adoption of traditional or overt masculine traits and behaviors is artificial and therefore toxic. As patronizing, diminishing, disorienting, and patently stupid as this ideological perspective is, it is almost never contested by sensible people who ought to, and instead resides there, half-articulated, tensely undermining, at the heart of everything to do with modern boys. In the social constructivist view of things, girls are closer to the golden mean of ideal behavior and temperament, and young men are deviated and estranged from it. There is a contradiction and dissonance, with social constructivism telling young men their identity is not inherent, and with a show like Adolescence giving them the message they are inherently dangerous. Why wouldn't they get their backs up and feel maligned and picked on? Why wouldn't they disengage even more? Yes, culture shapes some behaviors. Yes, boys are nudged, coached, and corralled into certain postures of toughness and detachment. But where the social constructivists err, sometimes willfully, is in refusing to grant that what many young men can thrive from is not dissociation from masculinity, but its full inhabitation. Young boys and men receive messaging that their gender is in decline and still patriarchally privileged, residually responsible for historical ills, and at the heart of most contemporary societal ills, due to a crashing and exposed socially constructed masculinity. So if at a half-conscious level, young white men feel they aren't regarded at all well historically, and in the present, many would be given to shrugging and just going further online. What progressive observers won't allow for is that these young men and boys assess a culture and society that seems snide and chiding towards them, and they decide to pass. Just as importantly, and unheeded by the sociologists and commentators, is the leverage young men and boys have in turning away. They take their cool male ironies, their energy, their more rough-hewn aesthetic inclinations, and their potential with them. To a certain extent, these young men, again at a half-conscious level, are kind of right to look back at society and see it, and its framing of them, as somewhat retentive and nagging and lame, or to fatalistically suppose some of the criticism must be right. After all, it is coming from establishment figures in institutions and the media. And, again, there is a strange and feeble absence of awareness in cultural analysis. The idea that young men might not feel like they're actually missing out on that much. That with their increasing disengagement, things haven't swelled and lightened into exciting, visceral, cultural and pop cultural phenomena that everyone else is getting borne along by while they sit things out. There is little to no social commentary that dares engage with the idea that those young males' malaise has a counterpoint in a wider cultural and pop cultural malaise. The most important disconnect, what the commentators haven't grasped, is that many boys don't feel they're being left behind. They feel that, in cultural terms, that everything has kind of ground to a halt. The abundance and instant access to pornography by pubescent and teen boys is not just a woefully under-addressed issue. It is one of the greatest societal failings of the 21st century. It is a significant driver of the issues related to modern masculinity. The link between pornography and misogynistic attitudes towards girls and women is important, but this has been a disproportionate and simplified focus, lacking in imagination and a willingness to courageously look into the subject with the kind of nuance and psychological depth it deserves. What deserves focus isn't a moral panic about porn per se, but a deeper psychological, social, and even philosophical disruption in the process of male adolescent identity formulation and desire. There has been scant focus on the notion that conventional sexual scenarios might ebb and pall as features of video content for boys at a fragile young age, and they might expand into more niche, kink, and fetishistic variations and categories in search of the dopamine hit of stimulation and exploration, delving and getting drawn into categories that their still developing minds have only a limited and inadequate means to cope with, so that by their latter teens or early 20s, some will have inevitably become partially desensitized to depictions of conventional sexuality. This is one of the most profound, unspoken shifts in the modern sexual landscape. Porn is a kaleidoscope of content, always on, algorithmically tailored, and infinitely escalating. The psychology of novelty seeking and dopamine desensitization is well documented. When applied to adolescent sexuality, it becomes deeply troubling. A 14-year-old boy's earliest exposures to sex aren't framed by human intimacy or clumsy mutual discovery, but by HD video, often portraying exaggerated scenarios or extreme acts that bypass emotional context and go straight to the visual chemical hit. This can lead to erotic exhaustion, where basic sexual scenarios lose their charge. Kinkification of desire, not driven by temperament, but by an overstimulated reward system. And fantasy detachment, where internal arousal templates become out of sync with real-life encounters. It's not just about what they're watching, but what that watching does to their capacity for sexual and emotional imagination. If your first 1,000 orgasms are to porn, not people, you're rewiring arousal around control, distance, and the frictionless satisfaction of a fantasy world that never says no, never misfires, and never requires vulnerability. While conventional pornography has had limited effect or bearing in terms of notions of shame, because the women on the screen are unknown and abstracted, there is an underexplored linkage between porn, young teen boys, and social media, where the object of a teen's interest is a girl at his school, whose social media is easily available, making them a subject or preoccupation, their images easily magnified, edited, and manipulated. aligned with or supplementing their consumption of pornographic content, which has psychological complications because it is no longer impersonal, and there are sharper, more consequential notions of shame and what amounts to voyeurism, as well as a dissociativeness in encountering the subject daily in real life, and a flurry of real-time variations. Social media closes the gap between fantasy and reality. The girl the boy watches on TikTok or Instagram is not a faceless adult film actor. He knows her. He sees her in the corridors. This is no longer abstract. It's personally directed erotic fantasy with real-world consequences of deep insecurity, dissociation, and fear of exposure, of discovery, of being labeled a creep or a pervert. In the modern context, technology, high-definition imagery, the ubiquity and customizability of preference and interest has created an immersive, addictively pleasurable and insular phenomenon that is too hard for many impressionable, developing young minds to resist or emerge from, with girls and relationships often being considered too problematic, on balance, to interact with in healthy expressions of physical pleasure in actual relationships. This is a tragic endpoint of the two earlier propositions. Porn becomes not just a stimulant, but a refuge, a low-risk, high-reward simulation of sex that doesn't require courage, conversation, compromise, or rejection. Now it can feel like the rational choice. No awkward dates, no emotional labor, no risk of public humiliation or being accused of transgression. For a boy raised in a digital attention economy, where rejection is potentially permanent and public, why wouldn't you choose the predictable dopamine hit of porn over the bewildering maze of female desire? But the consequences are stunted emotional development, delayed or dysfunctional relationship initiation, a rising tide of loneliness and confusion around desire. What I've laid out here is not just a sexual crisis, but a crisis of initiation. A collapse in the transitional rituals, cultural structures, and psychological mechanisms that once helped boys become men through embodied, social, and reciprocal experience. So many of the hand-wringing narratives around young men in crisis miss this. It's not just that boys are angry, disengaged, or misogynistic. Their desires are simultaneously overexposed and underdeveloped. The societal failure here is from a mixture of actual ignorance, willful ignorance, a lack of imagination, squeamishness, a misdirected sense of propriety, and diffidence. Modern educators, pedagogues, and parents have downplayed or refused to countenance the extent to which sexual accomplishment and confidence is a crucial element of young male development. That losing one's virginity, developing sexual stamina, and eliciting powerful, yielding responses from partners is a vaulting and clarifying phase for boys. More clinchingly, elements of society who are cynical toward masculinity have failed to properly distinguish between young male sexual aggression and sexual assertiveness, which are two separate things, but which those elements in society have conflated, sending further mixed messages to boys. Aggression disregards consent. Assertiveness requires it. Assertiveness is bold within a shared framework, but there is no longer anyone left to encourage boys to see the distinction. The fear of affirming male sexual assertiveness has led to the flattening of complex dynamics. When a young man senses that he can meet, not dictate, the terms of an encounter, and do so confidently, something unlocks. He knows where he stands. When that healthy dynamic is in play, the social and emotional elements of the relationship become far easier for him to contend with, because the sexual template is established and secure. Once it is, the boy will often be breezy, affable, tolerant, even romantic, because he is self-assured at that level of the deep template of the relationship for him. This point isn't remotely contentious. It is profoundly human and historically obvious. For many boys, sexual success is a rite of passage as a foundational act of affirmation and individuation. When a young man crosses that threshold, he walks differently, speaks differently. When boys are denied this clarifying passage, either through social dysfunction, porn-induced withdrawal, or fear of transgressing unclear boundaries, many don't stay neutral, they drift. None of this is ever properly discussed, because hardly anyone in the discourse sees an appeal in promoting young male sexual assertiveness, because they can't pass it from things they find problematic. There is a taboo around affirming assertive masculine sexuality. We no longer have language for the positive side of young male sexual energy. We have pathologies and warnings, but few stories of growth, transformation, vitality. And in the broader social fabric, you see the knock-on effects. Young men who don't show up in relationships, who self-sabotage, who drift into ideological extremes, or who simply opt out, because the most potent and terrifying arena of self-becoming has been made too treacherous to enter. Over the past decade, there has been a notable decline in the age at which boys experience their first sexual encounter, as well as an increase in sexual inactivity among young men. In 2019, only 38% of American high school students reported ever having had sexual intercourse, a decline from 54% in 1991. In the US, between 2009 and 2018, the percentage of men aged 18 to 24 reporting no sexual activity in the past year increased from 19% to 31%. There's space here for a cultural reckoning, one that says it's good for boys to become men who are sexually confident, letting them explore power dynamics, letting them initiate without ideological framing. That conversation isn't happening because the language for it has been rendered unpalatable. And at the heart of it, again, it's the social constructivists. If gender is socially constructed, as they maintain, then gender power dynamics are also to a large degree socially constructed, and in reality should be more fluid, less aligned to strict binaries, that boys are maiming their natural ideal selves by feeling they have to perform demanding peer pressure-driven constructed identities of sexual toughness, braggadocio, scoring, emotional distance, and a posturing macho image, when in reality they are more sensitive, would actually be craving sensual understanding and the divesting of developmentally arresting and dated constructions of masculine identity, and truly embrace their erotic giving persona, unencumbered by toxic learned constructed male identity. Problem is, most young guys actually do want to fuck, and it's not socially constructed or peer pressure or learned identity formulation that's inhibiting their true sexual persona. It's having not yet divested themselves of all the societal, social constructivist, overly nannied messaging and garbage. At which point, his stroppy moments of sulky exasperation on the sports field will fade, his resilience and problem-solving improve, and his relationship with his parents and siblings become demonstrably more chilled out. But to say that young men are, at a deep level, affirmed and clarified by unabashedly masculine sexual agency, is to blaspheme against the central liturgy of the constructivist view of gender. The constructivists, many of whom genuinely believe they are liberating young men, have in fact become gatekeepers to a form of psychosexual confusion and paralysis, by insisting that sexual expression must always be reframed as ideology, and by often disparaging straight male behaviors around desire as outdated or comically fragile. But you can't shame a 17-year-old boy out of his instincts. You can only confuse him. And a confused boy is not a feminist ally. He is a ticking time bomb of resentment, withdrawal, or maladaptive compensation. So here's the blasphemous thesis in clean, lethal terms. What many boys need is not re-education or a new gender model. What they need is to fuck well and know they did. And once they do, much of the angst evaporates. At that point, a teen boy, who is in most senses at the bottom of the barrel in terms of money, respect, freedom, assets, and practically everything else, is in one shattering, magical instant with a pretty 17 or 18-year-old girl, as accomplished and successful as any tyrant, billionaire, king, emperor, prince, or celebrity in the entire sweeping history of civilization. In the US, approximately 74% of school counselors are women. Similarly, in the UK, in addition to 3/4 of teachers being female, the majority of school psychologists are female. Research indicates that boys often prefer male counselors for personal or social issues. Therapists are encouraged to reflect on their own assumptions and biases regarding adolescent males and masculinity, but that doesn't mean they are going to follow through with such reflections. unexamined stereotypes can inadvertently create environments that feel invalidating to young men, hindering the development of trust and rapport. Implementing male-friendly therapeutic approaches, such as incorporating activities that appeal to boys and fostering a non-judgmental atmosphere, and not giving them a sense they're being maneuvered towards some premeditated outcome, can enhance engagement and effectiveness. Changing the gender ratio of counselors would be an obvious, practicable fit, but no one would be willing to admit that women could be in any way limited or have any realistic contextual drawbacks in their practice or skills or be any less effective in any way than men, so it won't happen. In the modern age, we've gone from cool androgyny to pussyish androgyny. Cool androgyny was subversive, playful, lasciviously and louchly sexual, and was in the zeitgeist. Mick Jagger, David Bowie, Lou Reed. It had provoking ironies. The men were often brazenly, promiscuously hetero, which lent it a sexual charge for young women and a taunting quality to straight-laced men who weren't faring nearly as well with women. Modern androgyny is just shit, mainly because its playful, provocative ironies are absent, and it is just a plainer, drabber, watered-down version of gender on both sides, leading, on the male side, to a vapidly unrelatable archetype you see again and again, of men with a scarcity of relatably masculine characteristics and comportment, and nothing appealing by means of redirecting or compensation, just effete, tedious types. And the aspect here that is important is that progressive observers will look at hierarchies of positions in, for example, entertainment and say, look, there is a preponderance of men in influential positions, without stopping to think and look at the men in question, or think for a moment that such men might seem inanely lightweight in the eyes of great swaths of mainstream guys, especially young guys. Amazon's The Rings of Power's showrunners, Star Trek head honcho Alex Kurtzman, Star Wars auteur Rian Johnson, and major player Dave Filoni. So cynics who look to male dominance of an industry lack the imagination to progress their assessment beyond that alone to actually assessing the archetypes of the men who, to most cool young guys, would seem unrelatable, cringeworthy, and lame. To even touch upon this idea would be impermissible because it would seem like an attack on more sensitive variations of masculinity. Modern popular music is garbage. Any self-respecting person who listens to the contemporary music charts knows this is true, and can acknowledge that compared to the luminaries of the last few generations, from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones to Bob Dylan, David Bowie, Aretha Franklin, and Elton John, to Led Zeppelin, Queen, the Smiths, to Nirvana, none of the modern processed, derivative, melodically insipid slop is going to endure as classics, and that if Hey Jude or Bohemian Rhapsody were released on Monday, everyone would be animatedly discussing it by Friday. No one in mainstream media discourse could ever countenance the idea that the dreary and sad drop-off in quality could be connected to disengagement from young men, because that would, of course, impermissibly suggest young men and their bands are a necessary element of a thriving musical culture. Well, it is, and for two reasons: competitiveness and musicianship. Generally speaking, studies show that male proclivities lean towards things and women's proclivities towards people. Men have a slightly greater interest and place a greater emphasis on technology and processes, especially gadgets, and women slightly more on emotion, interpersonal relationships, and language. Extrapolating from this, you have a musical cultural dynamic. Boys tend to prefer the technical and musical proficient elements, as well as the camaraderie of being in bands, while girls tend to prefer the solo artist dynamic, with more of an emphasis on the emotional relatability of the music. As a consequence, boys value musical instrumentation with its sweatier physical elements of drumming and show-off elements of guitar playing, the pleasurable tight syncing of rhythm and making a ruckus from which the great bands emerge. The music is great because the musicians have evolved a musical relationship and there is total autonomy of the song, from composition to performance. Hence the Stones and the Beatles and Led Zeppelin et al. Nirvana practiced every day for 6 months before they went in to record Nevermind, and you can hear it. By contrast, if you criticize Taylor Swift, one of her fans, a Swiftie, will roll her eyes at your lameness and almost always respond with, "But haven't you heard the words to this song? Or you wouldn't understand how powerful the lyrics are to this song." The emphasis is far less on the structure, musicianship, and melodies of the songs, which to any informed ear are deeply conventional, and rather on the emotive relatability of the lyrics. But the lyrics aren't the music. The music is the music. Bands used to be the mainstay of the American Billboard charts. Now there will, on any given week, be perhaps 1 or 2 bands in the Billboard Top 100, the rest made up of solo artists who have a removed and often transactional relationship with the musicians who perform on the songs. Secondly, great music has always thrived on male competitiveness. In the 30s, in the American South, the news would spread like wildfire if a king had been pushed off his throne by a rival pianist in smoky bars, where entertainers, sometimes with rap sheets, would flaunt and strut and dazzle audiences with their musicianship and patter. In the 60s, rival musicians were incessantly stealing each other's girlfriends. Arguments would break out over who was going to top the billing on shows, with the undercard acts doing everything in their power to steal the top liner's thunder. Acts would listen to a rival band's production innovations on a new album and do everything to up the stakes. In the 80s, rap battles would take place in rundown inner cities, where rival rappers would fight to earn or defend their reputation, with improvised lyrics over a beat. Dissing a rival and building credibility, the rivalry and competition would hone and sharpen musicians' talents and instincts. Now, it is more about the ego, social media profile, looks, and style of the contemporary solo artist. Again, there is no space in the wider discourse to allow for the idea that contemporary music might suffer from a drop-off in compelling, brashly lascivious boys and young men. Another aspect is the prevailing cynicism about boys and young men having their own cultural spaces, and the attitude that it is fitting, even overdue, for women to make an imposition into them, with the obnoxious mindset that if a brand, or IP, or sphere of culture doesn't feature a form of representation, it must therefore suffer from a lack of representation, and this ought to be remedied. Gaming, a sphere in which young guys could enjoy some escapist fun and power fantasy realization and intense visceral gameplay, with often coarse banter and sledging, saw the rise of patently ridiculous identity politics-ridden games and preposterous characters with current-day contrivances such as Dustborn or Concord or Veilguard. Meanwhile, Star Wars projects of late have either been fair to middling in ratings or cratered entirely because no one watched. Marvel and superheroes in general have tapered off long ago as a cultural phenomenon into slop content, and Dustborn and Concord were also financial calamities that no one played. Has or could it ever be asserted that boys and young men can have their own cultural spaces without it being a privileged or problematic construct? Not really. Short-form video, YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels are probably the biggest substitute, with creators feeling more relatable and interactive than Hollywood productions. And YouTube, long-form and mid-form content, with educational, commentary, lifestyle, and creator-led content are massive draws. And it is at least a redoubt from all the nagging, priggish bullshit aimed at boys, and territorially sequestered from prissy incursions. Young men are disappearing from the humanities. Too often, this drop-off is framed as a deficit in them. Lack of discipline, intellectual laziness, fear of non-instrumental learning. But that obscures something just as important. Young men don't necessarily see themselves as left behind by a humanities that has gotten better, shrewder, and more essential. It's that, increasingly, they look at the contemporary humanities and think, this isn't serious. Because for a certain kind of intellectually ambitious young man, today's humanities can look less like a site of difficult, meaningful inquiry, and more like a theater of moral sorting. To them, the classroom isn't a space of mutual discovery, but a space where many assumptions are preloaded. Why enter a faculty where your presumed identity precedes your arguments? The cultural atmosphere in many humanities faculties, especially in fields like English, cultural studies, and theory, has grown increasingly didactic. There's a sense that the outcome of inquiry is already known. When subject matter is treated as axioms rather than arguments, curious students start looking elsewhere. And those curious young male students are looking elsewhere. YouTube essayists, long-form podcasts, Substacks. These have become, for many young men, a kind of shadow university. If humanities faculties are serious about the future of their disciplines, they'll stop hand-wringing over lost boys and start asking harder questions about what they've become. Because those young men haven't stopped caring about culture or meaning, they've just stopped thinking the academy is where you go to find it. With a disproportionate focus on identity politics, disproportionate focus on resentful or historical causality and redress, or the holding of the past to account, and the potential for offense blunting the essential academic rigor of contested ideas, this comes across as a culturally and attitudinally unappealing environment for young men. If the humanities are shedding a gigantic demographic, the onus is on them to stop approaching the situation in terms of a demographic that for a prolonged time was unassailably in the ascendancy and has undergone some abrupt role reversal that they're struggling with. Rather, to just look at it in terms of you, as a college system and culture, are increasingly unappealing to a gigantic demographic whose potential and talents are being underutilized to your detriment, and that academic institutions are not necessarily benefiting from a skewing toward cohorts less and less representative of the demographics of wider society. And so, all of this eventually brings us back round to where we started. Just how terribly lame and inadequate the discourse has been around the streaming hit adolescence. When it comes to Andrew Tate and the so-called manosphere and incels, I would argue that isn't the primary issue for white boys, not by a long shot. All that stuff is partly a phase that a lot of boys go through because it is cool for a while to dwell on ideas of status and sexual ambition, and it is partly a byproduct of all the often harder to express elements of social constructivist intrusiveness and blurring, the ubiquity of porn, social media, and the malaise, both on their side and for the culture as a whole, that comes from boys and young men opting out of a mainstream culture they see as dispassionate toward them, and to which they are dispassionate in turn, and they're finding new spheres in which to gather and express themselves. The manosphere is garbage too, of course, telling boys that hedonism is the way, that they're getting blamed for all the ills in the world, and to build their status, a sphere which has little to do with integrity or increasing critical thinking skills, or just being a better person. But 13-year-old white boys aren't going out and stabbing girls to death because of what they've picked up from the manosphere, leading to explosive incel rage. There is a subtle but crucial difference between boys giving up and boys turning their back. Society hasn't figured that out yet. Many boys are disaffected and adrift in every facet of their lives because of insidious media and tech and bullshit prevailing ideological attitudes. There are plenty of good conversations to be had about boys and plenty of solutions, but there are too many priggish grown-ups getting in the way.